Hi guys, I'm going to throw together just a quick video. This isn't going to be super fancy. I don't have any kind of fancy camera gear. I'm just doing this from my phone. But just trying to throw together some videos to be able to show people, what to expect going into trying to do some DIY type work on your own personal Porsche. I have a 991.1 Carrera S cab. I'm going to go ahead and what I'm going to be doing today is I'm actually going to be replacing the brakes, but I'm going to be upgrading the rotor size along with going to GT3 pads in the front. And then on the rear, I will be doing an upgraded brake rotor size as well to 350 millimeters. And then I will be doing a standard pads in the rear with a 10 millimeter spacer kit for the rotors. So I'm primarily using basically like factory type parts and components. And there's actually a thing that you can do with this from going from the standard brakes on the 911S. You can actually go from the 991.1, you can actually use the 997 the 997 turbo brake rotors. So today I'm going to kind of show you that, run through it real quick. Just moved into my new house, so a lot of boxes all over the place. Eventually I'm going to tighten this all up and make it more of a workshop. But that's kind of like the main point of today's video is going to be hitting on what the things I purchased to make this happen, and then also I'll walk you through the process. So some of the things that I went ahead and purchased to do this repair, I do have my own personal tools. So when it comes to the actual tools required to do the work, I already have that. The biggest thing is I don't have a lift in my garage. So basically what I went ahead and did is I went to Harbor Freight, picked up some really simple 3-ton low profile jack stands, and then also a low profile jack. So this jack is 1.5 ton, roughly able to have the capacity to lift 3,000 pounds, which you're doing wheel by wheel. That shouldn't be an issue. And then also the profile on the gap here is going to be about 3.5 inches. So my car does not have the lowered suspension, so it is the stock factory height that the 991.1 Carrera S comes at. So I have more than enough space, but figured I'd get a low profile jack just in case in the future I do have to work on anything that is a little bit lower profile. Also went ahead, picked up a super cheap, I think it was like 24 bucks, little roller chair, just because doing this stuff kind of low, you're going to wind up wearing out your knees and everything like that. So you want to get yourself just some kind of little chair just to make sure that while you're doing these repairs, you're not blowing out your back or wearing out your knees. Outside of that, got some gloves. Those are basically the main things. Also went ahead and picked up some moving pads basically. So I'm going to use this kind of I want to keep the driveway or the garage floor looking pretty clean, so I'm going to wind up using this to catch any of the work debris. You're always going to have some brake dust and stuff like that come off the brakes once you're taking it all apart. So I figured I'd pick that up just to keep my area, my workspace clean. So next, I'll jump into the actual process here of getting started. All right, so jumping right in. The first step that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to obviously get the vehicle lifted up in the air, and you're going to want to take the wheel off. The best way of doing this is going to be to loosen the actual bolts first before you lift the vehicle up. This is going to make the process a lot easier for you than trying to do it once the wheel's off the ground. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to loosen the actual studs, all 5 of them, and then from there, then I will actually wind up lifting the car up. And Porsches are pretty straightforward. It's pretty simple. If you just look underneath on the bottom side here, there's going to be an area where you can actually lift the car. You can see right there is a little kind of like a lift pad. That's going to be the area that you're going to want to lift from, but then I'm also going to have to be cognizant of where I'm going to want to put the jack stand. So in a perfect world, I want to try to get the jack stand kind of where this lift point is, or along the pinch weld, which is the welded part of the frame running down and along. So once I get this all set up and taken care of, I'll recap and show you what that looks like. All right, so now as you can see, I went ahead and I did remove the wheel. I was able to use the jack stand, which is always the way to do it. Please don't be one of those people that work on cars with just a jack. If the hydraulics on the jack ever give out, the car will fall on you and not worth the risk. Just go ahead and get yourself some jack stands. Do it the right way. I worked as a mechanic for a very long time, both for BMW as a master tech and Porsche as a master tech. Seen a lot of people get hurt. Just follow the basic rules. It only takes you a little bit of extra time to follow the guidelines to make sure that you're safe. And then you also prevent yourself from getting injured. So went ahead and took off the wheel. Pretty easy and straightforward. Let me grab my tools right here. Basically what I used is a 1/2 inch breaker bar. That's what I used to break the wheels loose when it was on the ground. And then the only other thing that I needed was the 19mm deep socket. So make sure you get yourself a 19mm to get those bolts off. And then also make sure that typically most of these cars will have a wheel lock. The wheel lock is located in the front trunk, also known as the frunk for some Porsche people. So make sure to get that out of the car, and always use the right one for the stud that you're trying to get off there. So now the next step that I'm going to do is I'm going to sneak in here and show you kind of what it looks like. So the next step is going to be to disassemble this. I'm going to want to get the rotor, or I'm sorry, the caliper removed. You can take the bolts off back here. You can see there's a bolt here, and then there's another bolt down here. Before you do that, you're going to want to make sure that all of your hard wiring and stuff like that is loosened. So what I do is I'll take off this wheel speed sensor connector here. I'll also remove this 10mm right here, because Porsche does use a lot of hard lines. So as you can see, this brake line is a hard line. So the last thing you want to do is rip this thing back, take the bolts off, and wind up bending this hard line. You can cause issues then, possible leaks in the future. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to disconnect these connectors here, take off this 10mm, and also disconnect the wheel speed sensor so that all of this can go back nice and easy. And then what I'm going to wind up doing is I'm going to wind up hanging this off to the side so that it doesn't wind up getting hit by anything. And another thing I typically like to do is cover it then. So obviously you want to make sure this thing looks super pretty. I got this painted in the yellow. Typically these are red. But I really like the yellow look with my anthracite brown color, so I decided to do yellow. But you don't want to scratch these things up. You don't want to nick them or anything like that. So when you do get it hung back, as you're working, you will find you're going to drop stuff. Things are going to get in the way. The last thing you want to do is nick this. So hang it back and then also cover it with like a rag or something like that to prevent any damage to the nice, pretty caliper. So next, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take off those pieces that I told you, and I'm also going to remove those bolts as well, along with pushing back the pistons for the caliper as well. So there's going to be 6 pistons on this setup, and you're going to want to try to bring the brake pads back on both the inside and the outside. Typically, it's best to do it when the caliper is fixed. It can be a real pain to try and pull these back later. Handful of different ways to do this. You can do it with, they have actual tools that you can use like a spreader that'll actually spread it apart. The way I'm gonna do it, these rotors, as you can see, are toast. You can see all these grooves. I know I'm replacing the rotor, so I don't mind sticking a screwdriver in here and pushing it back. Some people will say that's not the right way to do it. I completely understand. I'm just saying that for purposes of what I'm doing today and the fact that I know that I'm not going to be reusing this caliper, I'm okay with prying on the pads on the inside and the outside with a flathead screwdriver just to get these things fully seated back to make it really easy when you go to put those new pads on. So just like I said, I wound up taking off that 10mm along with disconnecting the wheel speed sensor, and I also disconnected the brake pad wear sensor as well, just to get those out of the way to make sure that they're not going to tug on anything. No pressure on the hard wire. Was able to rotate the caliper, and I went ahead and just used the box that I already had. Some people will hook them to the springs. You can kind of tie them back. I still have to get through a lot of my tools, so I don't have my hooks that I typically would use. So in the meantime, I'm just using the box that the jack stands came in. As you can see, make sure that you cover your caliper. Very important. You don't want to do this job yourself and then wind up damaging your nice, beautiful caliper. So make sure that you do cover that up. And the next step here is I'm going to wind up removing the actual rotor. So pretty straightforward here. You're going to have two screws that you're going to have to get off. As you can see, it's 2 Phillips head. You got the one right there, and then the second one right there. Typically, you should be able to get this with a flathead screwdriver, or I'm sorry, with a Phillips head screwdriver and just holding the rotor. They do make what's called impact drivers. So if you're in an area where there's a little bit more rust, I'm in Southern California, so luckily for me, most of the stuff on this car actually comes off pretty easy. But I know I used to live on the East Coast, and over there, you get a lot of issues with rust and things kind of getting bound up. So you may need to use an impact driver, which will basically allow you to hit the screwdriver kind of in there, and then it'll actually counter and rotate at the same time. So it gives you a little bit more leverage. So I'm going to go ahead now and take off those 2 screws and then remove the original rotor from the vehicle. So now that I got the rotor removed, you can see the old rotor is right here. Now I am going to be upgrading to a 350 millimeter diameter rotor. This is actually off of a 997 turbo. So that is the cool part about this is the 991.1 Carrera S. The factory rotor is a little bit on the smaller side. So I'm gonna go ahead and upgrade to a 350, and that's gonna be both front and rear. So key thing here to remember is when you're digging through the parts and everything, always pay attention to the indicator where it says L or R for obviously left or right. That's always in reference to as if you're sitting in the driver's seat of the car. So if you're sitting in the driver's seat, left is the left side of you on the driver's side, right is the right side or the passenger side. So right here, I have the right rotor, also known as the passenger side rotor. And then also to determine between front and rear, one of the easiest ways to tell is the rears on the car will have a drum brake on the inside. There'll be like a drum ring for the parking brake. So as you can see right here, there's no drum ring. So that is another indicator. Obviously you can reference part numbers and all that to make sure you're not mixing anything up as well. But just for visualize it, those are the main things to keep an eye out for. Now, another thing you're going to notice too is that these rotors are improved. So these are actually going to be slotted rotors as well. So I'm hoping to be able to get a little bit more heat dissipation. And then also there's a lot more surface area here I'm upgrading to a GT3 pad. So you can see the surface area, the contact area where the pad will be touching is significantly wider than on the OEM, the original. So I actually have the space to be able to upgrade to a GT3 pad as well, which is going to be really nice because I'm getting more surface area, should get pretty good cooling with this rotor as well, and I'm still being able to use primarily factory components. So I'm not going, crazy aftermarket or anything like that, because I'm a big fan of improving little things, but also sticking with primarily OEM type stuff where you can. So I'm going to go ahead now, and I'm going to install this rotor, and then we'll go to the next step after that. So I went ahead and removed the OEM pads from the caliper, and I put them down here just so you can see the side-by-side comparison. Obviously there's the old rotor, you can see the grooves. You can also see the grooves in the pads that I removed. So these are the OEM 991.1 S front brake pads, and then these are actual GT3 pads, so also 991. But so that's the one thing that you can see right away is the size difference. So you can see the thickness here versus the thickness on the GT3 pads, a lot thicker here, so you can have a lot more contact area when it comes to the pad to the surface of the rotor. So also this should provide some pretty good improved braking for the vehicle. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna go put these pads in the caliper, replace the springs, go ahead and do, the typical, most of you guys have probably done this before when it comes to at least swapping over the springs, and then making sure, of course, as well, that you always replace the mounting bolts for the caliper itself. So I do have brand new mounting bolts right here. So always make sure to replace those caliper bolts. The reason that people say that is because the bolts are torque to yield, which means that basically when you're tightening these, if you're going to tighten it the right way, which you really should, you're going to want to tighten it to a certain spec, and then you're going to do a torque angle. So when you do that, in essence, what's happening is you're actually stretching the bolt. That's why the recommendation is to not reuse those mounting bolts. So I'm a big fan of following those types of directions, especially when it comes to important things like brakes, your wheel torque, all that stuff. So make sure that you are torquing things to spec. I'll make sure to review the specs that I'm torquing things to, just to make sure that I'm as transparent as possible with you. And then just always make sure that you're looking up the proper procedures when it comes to torque specs, because the last thing you ever want to do is have something not tightened enough or over torqued where you can have a bolt snap or something like that. So I'm going to go ahead, put these pads in, and then I'm going to go ahead and remount the actual caliper back onto the wheel, or the assembly right here, and then we'll go ahead and take a look at it. All right, so I went ahead and I mounted the caliper. So the caliper bolts, the torque spec is 85 Newton meters, or equal to 63 foot-pounds of torque. So for my specific vehicle, there's not a torque to yield. It's just a straight 85 newton meters. So just always make sure that you do torque them the spec. And then the little 10 millimeter bolt that I also replaced that goes to the like the hub assembly, that is 10 newton meters. So just make sure to always tighten that stuff to spec. When it comes to these little guys, I just snug those in. They don't really need too much oomph to them. It's literally just to keep it so that it's making sure that the hat is actually flush with the hub assembly and everything like that. So, but outside of that, I've got my nice clean caliper mounted with my larger size rotor. What's nice is with this conversion, as you can see, the rotor size is fine. So I do not need to use any spacers for the caliper. I can reuse factory bolts and everything like that. And you can see that the brake pad sticks out a little bit more. You can see like right here, see how the brake pad sticks out further because I'm using that GT3 pad. So really nice seamless conversion. Really does look nice. I like it much better than just the kind of drilled style that comes from the factory. It's a little bit cleaner look, and that's kind of the completion there for the front. So I'm going to go ahead and do the other side, and one thing I'll do is I'll throw the wheel back on, lower the car down on the ground, and then just do another recap video showing the complete process once it's all finished on this side. And then I'll wind up making another video when it comes to the rear, because the rear will be a little bit different because of the fact that we are going up in size significantly on the rotor, going to the same size, the 350 millimeter. So with that, on the rear, you will require 10 millimeter spacers as well. And also with that, I got some custom studs so that I can, instead of reusing the bolts, I do have a stud that'll be able to allow it to extend further back with the 10 millimeter spacer. So that's going to be in another video, but for the most part, I'll get this button back up, and then I will show you what the final product looks like once it's all together. So now what I did is I put the wheel back on, and I removed the jack stand, and I lowered the jack, but as you can see, the vehicle's still raised up. So I only lowered it down enough for the tire to touch so that it won't rotate when I go to torque the wheel. Now, the preferred way at the dealership level is that you would keep it up in the air. You'd have someone hold the brake pedal so that the wheel is not being touched against the ground at all, and then you would just have someone torque the wheel. Since I am here by myself, I'm allowing the wheel to just slightly touch the ground so it won't spin. And then another key thing that most people don't know, but if you're a real Porsche fan, this is going to be something that you will be able to notice as you walk around and look at other Porsches. The crest should always be facing towards the valve stem. So if you see the bottom of the crest should almost be like an arrow pointing down to the valve stem. And then also when it comes to the wheel lock should also be in line with the valve stem. So once again, Porsche, it's very, by the book. You make sure you torque everything, always make sure that everything's done properly, and that does not change even with little things and details like that. So if you do own a Porsche yourself, make sure to try and get this stuff all aligned to show that you are a true Porsche fan. Now, on top of that, I do have a digital torque wrench. So it is, the specs for the lug bolts are going to be 118 foot-pounds, also, or 160 newton meters. So I'm gonna go ahead and torque that up right now, and then after I'm done torquing that, I will fully lower the vehicle, and then the job will be complete. But overall, I'm really happy with the outcome. Rotor size is bigger, it looks a lot cleaner, and excited to get this car wrapped up and get it taken out on the road. All right, guys, now I'm gonna move on to the rear of the vehicle. So since I already kind of showed you the process on the front, I went ahead and just jumped ahead, got the car up on the jack stands, coming to the back side of the vehicle now, over here on the left-hand side. I'm gonna go ahead and pretty much do exactly what I was doing on the front. There is some differences with the rear because of the size increase. I believe, off the top of my head, I think it's 330 millimeter in the rear, the stock rotor size, but we're going up to a 350 just like the front. So because of that, the actual caliper will need to be, will need spacers and need to be pushed back a little bit. So I'm gonna kind of show you what that looks like. But from here, next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and take off the caliper. Just like on the front, you're gonna have two bolts. You got a bolt here, you got another bolt down over here. I'm gonna take those out and then also disconnect the brake sensor, and then I'll be able to swing this off. And what I'm gonna wind up doing is I'm gonna take it, and what's nice about this is you have a nice little shelf area back here. So as always, I'm gonna make sure to get a rag, put the rag up back here, set the caliper up there, wrap it nicely so that I don't have anything hitting it. Also make sure it's not against the rotor so that when you go to take the rotor off, you don't knock the thing down. But that's gonna be the next step, and then we'll go from there. All right, so I was able to get the caliper off. As I mentioned, you wanna make sure that you disconnect the brake pad wear sensor and take the one side out of the bracket, because if you look back here, you can see this will slide into a little bracket. You want to make sure to remove this because you're going to wind up tugging on that cable, and I've seen people break these connectors because they didn't disconnect it and remove it from that bracket. So definitely make sure you do that. It's an easy miss and an easy way to mess up the wiring for the brake sensor. So always make sure that's completely off. And then I was able to take off the caliper with a T55, just like the front. So next, I'm gonna pop off the actual rotor. Same, just like the front, it's just gonna be those two Phillips head screws, and then the rotor will come right off. Now, one thing to keep in mind is the parking brake is disengaged. So make sure that when you do this, the parking brake is disengaged. Otherwise, the parking shoes that are inside the rotor itself will be engaged. You will not be able to get the rotor off. So beforehand, make sure that you do have the parking brake disengaged. All right, so now I got the original rotor removed. As you can see, here is the drum brake setup that is used for the parking brake. I'm gonna wind up cleaning this all up too. That's another thing to make sure you do is, clean up, use some brake clean, make sure you get as much of the brake dust off as you can everywhere. You wanna always make sure that everything's clean when it's going back together. Now you're gonna see, these are the two areas right here where I'm gonna actually be putting in studs now. So before it was the standard screws. So as you can see right here, here's the original bolt that I removed. But since I'm gonna be relocating the caliper further back by about 10 millimeters, I'm actually gonna wind up using, for me, I went to Giro Disc, and that's what I got the studs right here. So here's the stud itself. And then also in the kit, as you can see right there in the bag, I also have the 10 millimeter spacers that'll sit right here once this is threaded in. Now the key here, what's nice is they do come with instructions, so it is pretty straightforward. So I'm not gonna walk through that entire process, but I will at least kind of give you a high level overview about what I'm about to do. First thing is right here, I have a chaser, this little yellowish thing in my hand. So I'm gonna go ahead and chase the threads. All that's gonna do is clean it up to make sure that this goes in nice and smooth without any kind of, issues. Then what I'm gonna actually do as well is on the threads here that are gonna actually go into like the hub assembly, I'm gonna put a little bit of Loctite. So I do have the Loctite that came with the kit, that little blue bottle right there. So I'll wind up putting just a little bit right on these threads. So typically what I'll do is just a straight line going straight down right like that with the Loctite. And then that'll be enough to, once it's in there, it'll seal once it dries, and then it'll prevent it from backing out. Now, extremely important is make sure that you're following the torque specs, especially with studs. The last thing you want to do is put this thing in, think that it's tightened, but you actually didn't get it all the way down. And then next thing you know, this thing slowly backs out over time, and then you start getting your caliper gets a little wobbly and makes noise. And if you postpone it long enough, could potentially come off and cause, some other major issues. So make sure that you are torquing these. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do the steps I just said. I'm going to put that Loctite on here. I'm going to thread it in, and then I'm going to torque it to spec. And then if you look at these instructions right here, it does say right there, line number 7. After I get it threaded in by hand, you don't want to zip these things in at all. The torque spec is going to be 10 foot-pounds. Now, another thing that you're going to notice is you're not going to be able to tighten it with this nut on here. So the way that you're going to torque this is I went ahead, let me show you just in my hand right here. I went ahead and just purchased 2 nuts that'll fit onto those threads. And what you can do is you can double nut these. So what you'll do is you'll double nut it like this, and then you'll turn when you want to tighten it to the actual spec, you'll only rotate the one on the outside. So that's going to drive the whole thing in. And then when it comes to loosening, to make sure that you don't back it off and re-loosen the torque that you just applied, you'll put a wrench on the inside one, and then you'll rotate the outside one off to separate the two from each other, and then you can just spin them off, but then the stud itself will be fully torqued. So I'm going to go ahead and do those next steps, and then we'll go from there. All right, so I am going kind of quick because kind of getting tired here, so I'm trying to get it all wrapped up. But either way, I got the studs in. As I said, using that double nut technique, I could actually tighten it to spec. It was 10 foot-pounds for each of these studs to get them locked down with the thread locker on the threads down in there. So both of those are now installed. Now the next thing all I gotta do is I just gotta put the 10mm spacers on here, slide them right on. Then I'm gonna put the caliper on top of that. And then after the caliper is on, the very last thing for me to do, here we get these. Very last thing we're gonna do once the caliper is on with the proper spacers, spacing out the caliper to the rotor, then all I need is this little washer, and then this is the nut that I will put on the end. And I'm gonna go ahead then and tighten both caliper bolts to 50 foot-pounds of torque. As you can see right here, they actually have a spec right there for you, so it makes it pretty easy. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. And then, oh yeah, also I'm gonna throw in the pads. I separated the pads, pulled them out, swap springs, all that. Gonna get all that wrapped up too. But for the most part, I just wanted to make sure that you're aware for this conversion that you're gonna need to do the 10mm spacers with the studs in the rear. It's one of the biggest differences from the fronts, but outside of that, it's pretty seamless. So I'm gonna go ahead now and go on with mounting the caliper, and then I'll show you what that finished product looks like. All right, so now I've got it all bolted back up, got the caliper back on, got the new pads installed. Spacing is set back properly. As you can see, the pad sticks out a little bit down here, and it's actually perfectly spaced, both top and bottom. So after I went ahead and torqued the nut, both for the two studs to that 50 newton meters, I also went ahead and reconnected the brake pad wear sensors. Make sure you always replace those and get them connected back in. A lot of people forget to plug them back in, so make sure that that's something that you don't forget when you're doing this repair. But now I've got some nice oversized rotors, primarily using, for the most part, factory components. So I'm gonna go ahead now, throw the wheel on, torque everything to spec when it comes to the wheels and everything, and then I will recap and show you the final product. So here's the final product. Everything all wrapped up, looks really good. I think the rear is the most impressive. This is the largest increase in rotor size. You can see everything looks nice and clean. And also the front rotors are 350mm as well. And overall, I'm pretty happy with it.